do this. And if my name tag starts falling off, it's okay. It's been doing that all day. People keep like catching it for me. It's really okay. The name tag can fall on the floor. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of who I am, how I came to this work, why I am doing this particular workshop. I'm going to show you some pictures, because everyone likes some pictures, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll do just sort of conversation, question and answer, what you guys want to know, I think. Because I think that is probably the best use of our time. Cool? So, my name is Bekah Wolf, and I was born and raised in Santa Fe, actually. My father is the current musical director of Temple Beth Shalom, and has been president of the synagogue, and cantor, and stand-in, almost rabbi a number of times over the years. So I grew up in the synagogue. My mother was born Christian and converted while I was a teenager, but for the first about 12 years of my life, I was raised both Christian and Jewish. And I was a really normal Jewish American kid. I went to temple, I went to youth group, I was a member of youth group, I taught Hebrew school. When I was 17, I went on a Zionist youth trip to Israel. It was organized by NIFTY, the Northern Federation of Temple Youth, which is a national reform movement, the youth movement of the national reform movement of Judaism. And I lived on a kibbutz, and I hung out with some Israeli soldiers. There's actually a picture of me sitting on an Israeli tank at one point, which will be used to blackmail me at some point in the future, although everyone knows about it, so that's okay. And I really grew up in a very, very normal, sort of traditional American Jewish family. Liberals, my parents, were both sort of activists in the 1960s, but Zionists. They believed that Israel was the homeland for all Jews. And that only really started to change for me a few years later when I went to school in New York City, and I was a student activist during September 11th, 2001. And right after September 11th, 2001, one of the things that was happening in New York City was a concerted attack on Muslims and Arabs, right? There were enormous roundups of Arab people and Muslim people, and putting them in jail and initiating immigration proceedings against them and stuff like that. And so I was doing immigrant rights work, so that seemed like a natural extension of that. And then it turned into sort of anti-war work, because the pending war on Iraq what became an issue, and the war in Afghanistan was an issue, and we were having protests saying, not in our name, we're New Yorkers, we lived here in New York, we don't want a war because of this tragedy. And what was happening at those protests was they were mostly organized by, at least at New York University, they were organized by Arab students and Muslim students. And there was enormous backlash, not from the people I expected, the Republican students or something. There's not a lot of those at NYU, but, or the more conservative students. The backlash against the demonstrations was from the Israeli support group on campus called Torch Pack. The Torch Pack. The torch is the symbol of NYU, and pack as in APAC. They were the APAC of NYU. And what they decided to do was to attack the demonstrations. Now, again, these were anti-war, anti-American war on foreign countries. It had nothing to do with Israel-Palestine, but the Israeli students, they're not Israeli students, the Israeli Student Solidarity Group decided that that was enough of a reason, that there was a gathering of Arabs and Muslims, and they were against that. And so one day they rented a Humvee and put an Israeli flag on the top of it and had a megaphone out the window, and were driving around the demonstration in the middle of New York City near Washington Square Park, driving back and forth across from the demonstration, shouting death to the Arabs. And I thought, I don't think I'm on that team. So at that time, the Second Intifada was happening in Palestine. And so there was enormous repression on Palestinians by the Israeli military. And as in the big cities all over the country, as the anti-war movement against a war in Iraq developed, there was a stronger and stronger call to include Palestine in that issue, to say it's really important for us not just to address America's policies in the Middle East in a vacuum, but also to realize that this is integrally related to our policy on Israel-Palestine. That's how I got into Palestine solidarity activism. I went to Palestine as an activist for the first time in 2003. I went twice in 2003 and 2004 for a total of 4 months, volunteering with the International Solidarity Movement. And what we were doing at that time was joining peaceful protest, right? And what the protest movement at the time was very interesting, because the Second Intifada, which started in 2001, began in the beginning as a mass nonviolent movement. People were protesting Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, going to Al-Aqsa Mosque with 1,000 police officers and declaring this land ours. So there was a reaction to that. It started as protests, and the protests were immediately repressed by the Israeli military. 13 people killed the first day, several more killed in the following weeks, which then led to an escalation in the armed resistance, right? The suicide bombings and the people actually taking up arms. So there was a lull in the ability of Palestinians to do nonviolent resistance. It seemed impossible. The military was everywhere. They had reinvaded the villages and the cities of the West Bank. They had they were still always in Gaza at the time. And protests seemed impossible. Every time people gathered in a large group, the Israeli military was attacking it.
Would it be too hot
And
if we
so,
close the store?
huh?
Too warm if we close the store?
Yes. I'm like already sweating. So in that period of time, in 2003, the Israeli military started building the wall. And the wall is a series of wall and fences that's built inside the West Bank to separate Palestinians from, in theory, Israel, but actually was built through Palestinian agricultural land and separating people from their own agricultural land. And so the farmers along those villages, in the tiny villages where this wall was being built, decided they had to do something and that they had to reinvigorate this nonviolent resistance. And so in 2003 it started. By 2004 there were dozens of villages protesting all the time, trying to stop bulldozers. And that was when I went to volunteer for the first time. And so I was in a couple of different places. Has anybody heard of the town Budrus? There's a movie about it. Yeah. So that's where I started. And then Biddu, I was there for a total of almost 4 months in 2003, 2004. And then I had a little bit of a layoff because Israel didn't let me in the country for a while. And in 2005 I tried to go and they refused me. And then in 2006 I returned. And we're going to get to the slides in just a minute because this is where the story pretty much ends. In 2006, I went again with the International Solidarity Movement. There was a new town called Beit Omar, which was resisting not the construction of the wall, but the construction of a fence, a secondary fence that was surrounding a settlement. Beit Omar is surrounded by settlements on 3 sides, including perhaps the most famous settlement called Bat Ain, which is notorious for having a militia that attempted to blow up Arab girls' schools in Jerusalem in 2002. They're famous for that because they got caught. That's my neighbors. Those are my neighbors. So in 2006, a group of internationals went to Beit Omar to support the farmers in trying to stop the bulldozers from literally bulldozing their land, taking down their trees. I remember meeting a guy who was the organizer. He spoke very little English. I was the only one that spoke any Arabic. And he had just been arrested the day before and released. All the other internationals had been arrested the day before, so we were a brand new group of people. And we were like, we're gonna get arrested. This is bad. Okay. And I was the only one who had been there before, and I had brought my friends this time, and I was like, okay, this is what we're doing. So the next morning it was like, we're gonna go with this guy. It was his land. he was going to go and sit in front of bulldozers and try to stop the demolitions, the bulldozing and the demolition of the agricultural land. And I said, and we were like, okay, we're gonna go. It's gonna be awesome. And I remember walking up with him and getting up to the place where the bulldozers were, and we got there and we were it. The rest of the farmers hadn't come yet, and it was like, this is not going to be good. So the military immediately tried to arrest him as the leader. And I had just done a nice training for all the internationals on how to nonviolently prevent arrests, because, of course, if a Palestinian is arrested in the West Bank, he can be held 8 days before seeing a judge. That 8 days can be extended by 180 days without going for charges, and that 180 days can be extended indefinitely. So they could just keep doing 180, 180. So the arrest of a Palestinian is incredibly serious. It has a lot of ramifications for that person and their family, and so we're trying to stop arrests. It's one of the main reasons internationals go there. So I just trained this group on how to do this, and it was like, okay, we're going to do this in real life. And I remember we all piled on top of him and we're holding on to him, and the soldiers were incredibly brutal and were dragging the internationals off of him and putting the internationals in headlocks and handcuffing them to the side. But the soldiers are usually a lot more rough with men than with women, so I ended up being like the last international with this guy. And he had been hit with the soldiers had hit him with the butt of their gun, and so he was hurt and he was lying on the ground. And I was lying on top of him, which, like, P.S., really not supposed to do that in Palestine. Right? So it's like the only time that you get, you know, like, to just hug a random man that you have not met and you're not married to is in a situation when, you know, the Israeli military is trying to take him. So I'm sort of, like, doing this and also trying to, like, fix his shirt so that, you know, he's not exposed. And I'm telling him to get up and run, that I was going to stand in front of the soldiers and I wanted him to run, and he couldn't because he had been injured. And the soldier, while I was lying on top of this guy, took his gun and rammed it into the man's groin and said, in Hebrew, "You're a son of a whore," right? It's a very common insult. And I, who know like 6 words in Hebrew, said, "No, you're a son of a whore," in Hebrew, because I actually know that word in Hebrew. And the man on the ground was arrested. And 9 days later, he was brought to a military court. It was the first time I'd ever been to the military court, because, of course, Palestinians in the West Bank only are charged under military regime. There is no civilian court for them. So he was taken to the military court, and he was actually released on bail. But I was in the audience at the military court, and I remember going up and like shaking his hand and saying, "Are you okay?" And, you know, he said he was okay. And he tells me that that was the moment that he decided he wanted to marry me. I think it took me a little bit longer. His name is Musa, and we are married. And we have a 2.5-year-old daughter. And a few months after that, we co-founded the Palestine Solidarity Project. I like that story. It's like the best meeting your husband story ever. I mean, no one can top. I dare you to top that. So in 2006, we started this thing called the Palestine Solidarity Project, and the goal of it was to do 2 things. One was to continue to support the Palestinian nonviolent resistance, and the other was to develop Palestinian capability to organize themselves, right? Because this is a huge piece that's been missing in international solidarity. That it's not enough to just say, we're going to help you, or we're going to come and witness for you. That's very good. It's an excellent start. But it's also about giving Palestinians the resources they need in order to organize effectively. And so I have been doing that ever since. In 2007, I moved there permanently, and I lived there permanently until 2010. Since 2010, my daughter and I have been going back and forth. And Musa still is there and still runs PSP. So what I witnessed in that period of time was an evolution of Palestinian nonviolent resistance, right? It started under enormously difficult circumstances. It started in circumstances not only in circumstances of what the Israeli military was doing in terms of a full reinvasion of the cities and villages, which meant that during the period of Oslo, right, part of the sort of tacit agreement was that the Israeli military would remove itself from the city centers. They still had enormous presence throughout the West Bank, and they were controlling entry and exits of the villages, of the cities, and they were also still fully in control of the villages. But in 2001, they reinvaded. They took over the entire rest of those cities. But by 2006, that had almost disappeared. And the situation in 2006 was that there was this tacit agreement with the Palestinian Authority that the Israeli military would limit its presence in the cities in exchange for Palestinian Authority beefing up their security and beefing up their own police forces. But that didn't affect the villages. The villages, because of the way the West Bank is divided up into areas A, B, and C, the Israeli military always had authority from the Oslo agreements to be in full control of the villages, which is over 60% of the West Bank. It's actually, if you consider everything except for the land of those big cities, it's more like 80% of the West Bank. So the military refocused its presence in the villages and the connecting areas between the cities. So you could be in a city, and that is the case till today. You can be in a city in Ramallah, in Nablus, in Bethlehem, and be relatively separate from the Israeli military. The Israeli military is only occasionally going in to arrest people, but there's not an ongoing military presence inside the city. Where they are is at the entrances, on the highways, at the checkpoints, in between everything, right? And where they are, of course, is around the settlements and the settlement roads, so where Jews are living and traveling. That is, in theory, what the Israeli military is doing in the West Bank, is protecting the settlements. And of course, settlements are built where? Right on top of villages. That's where they're built. They're built on lush agricultural land, which, of course, you know, if you're a farmer, you're like living near the good agricultural land. So the Palestinians are living in villages that have agricultural land that's being continuously encroached on by settlements. And for those of who has been there, oh, fantastic. So you know that, and you can help me describe for people who haven't, how incredibly small this area is. So when I talk about a settlement being built on top of a Palestinian village, I'm talking about, in some cases, 200 or 300 yards away, right? From houses. So house to house, 200 or 300 yards. It is incredibly close in some areas. And in Beit Omar in particular, where we started our work, it was a microcosm of the entire situation, which was that even though, in theory, the Intifada was over by 2005, and so starting in 2006, 2007, this was supposed to be a period of, you know, oh, maybe we'll get negotiations going again. And in that same period of time, while the Israeli military, except for that war on Gaza in 2008 to 2009, the Israeli military was not doing big, high-profile activities in the West Bank. It was much more of a slow, methodical theft of land. It was about settlers first, soldiers first forbidding Palestinians from going into certain agricultural lands that were close to the settlement, and then slowly the settlers would be allowed in that area, and then eventually they would build a fence around that area. That's generally the progression. And it was happening over and over and over again. To the extent where my husband, just one person in Palestine, has lost almost 80% of his agricultural land in the last 10 years. So we're talking about since the Second Intifada. And that is very common. And so what has happened as a result of that is that Palestinians are trying to organize nonviolent resistance. It's really important to understand that Palestinians have always had an element of nonviolent resistance. They have always had unarmed protests from the beginning of protests. From the 1930s, when they were protesting against the British mandate, the idea of a bunch of people getting in the street and marching is not something that only Westerners do, as we all know, right? in Palestine, it became all the more important because the communities were so separated. And so part of what the goal of the current movement for nonviolent resistance is to break out of those divisions. So instead of just focusing on my village, my land, right, the confiscation that's happening right here, to try to unite the different movements and different communities that are dealing with it. And that is sort of where Palestinian nonviolent resistance is today, are these attempts to create unification. Yes?
Not to interrupt, but
That's fine.
I am particularly interested in one thing, so I wanted to make sure maybe I could get you to talk about it. Over the last, how many ever years I've been doing this, I think one of the things that shocked me the most, in fact, more than anything, was the use of children and in families to intimidate, as used as a form of expansion. So I wondered, just because of what's happened, I mean,
as a form of
who are
using which children?
I think of the constant encroachment as the goal.
Right.
And so therefore to go to an area where the land is desired, and then to use the children and the families of nonviolent resistors to me, I don't know that this is really a tactic, but it seems like when you go into a village, you take pictures of children, you come back, you target children, arrest children, take the children away from the family, that would send a message to that village, and that would maybe, make people leave. I mean, maybe this is in my mind, but it just seems like an unusual way of harassing a village.
Well, so let's get into that. So what is happening today, and that's a good interlude to go to my slides, which are going to come on immediately. So it's my fault. It's the vocabulary.
The other one went tired too. They both went to sleep. This one.
So what's happening today are communities individually resisting against whatever encroachment is happening. So whether it's a settlement, the wall, a new military outpost, these kinds of things. Okay, this one's on now, that one's not. Two really important things have happened in the last year that I want to focus on. One is sort of an extension of what you're talking about, Annie, which is that as nonviolent resistance has gotten more attention internationally, the tactics that the Israeli military has used to repress it have become more and more aggressive. So the idea that the Israeli military comes in the middle of the night and arrests people from their homes is incredibly common. That is not a new tactic. They do it all the time. The fact that they do that to people as young as 13 and 14 is also not new. What's important to understand is that there's organized protests, and then there's also spontaneous protests that happen all the time in Palestine as a reaction to the presence of the military or the presence of something new. And so you have youth that are going and confronting a military jeep that is just driven into their village. And those kids are also being arrested from their homes in the middle of the night. But what is happening is that as Israel is more and more intimidated by nonviolent resistance, they're using the tactics that they used to reserve really for security risks for the entire population. So you have, and this is not new, but I think there's more attention being drawn to it. So 14-year-olds being arrested as from their homes has happened since the first Intifada, since the 1980s. This is not a new tactic of targeting young people. I think it's getting a lot more attention. But young people tend to also be the people that are most involved in protest. And the Israeli military has has in fact outlawed Palestinian protests. It is illegal for Palestinians to protest. And so they use that as a principle to sort of arrest anybody. But the act of arresting young people is not new. And it is certainly a tactic used to repress a population, right? Because parents are afraid of allowing their children to be arrested, and so that is certainly a a factor in whether or not parents are going to be activists, whether or not they're going to let their children be activists. But to be honest, in Palestine, since there has been so much repression for so many years, it doesn't factor in quite as much as I think we would think of it. People's kids are being arrested all the time. There's a family in Beit Omar that has 6 sons. They've all been arrested at least 3 times. It happens every 3 or 4 months, someone else is arrested, right? That's an extreme case because it's a family of activists, but not that extreme. So,
So does Biddamore have, is that a normal amount for all the towns to have that many kids? Or
it is a normal, it's a normal amount for a village that has, that is active, so that has regular protests and that has the presence of settlers that's very kind of a presence of settlers and soldiers that's kind of ongoing. So Beit Omar is not unique in the fact that it has a military watchtower, a permanent Israeli military presence at the entrance of it. Not all villages have that, but many do. But yeah, I mean, when there is a village that is involved in some sort of activity, whether that's organized protest or more spontaneous, like we're gonna go throw rocks at the settlement, even though the settlement is behind this fence and our rocks aren't getting anywhere near them, arrests are incredibly common. So that was, you know, it's true that there's been a reemergence of this, of the attempts to organize and nationalize or internationalize even Palestinian protest, and that attention has brought the Israeli military to crack down on popular protests even more. The other thing that I was going to say that's happened in the last year that's really significant are the hunger strikes. In a few months ago, right, starting in February, I want to say, a few people who are in administrative detention, which is the process of holding Palestinian detainees without charge or trial, which my husband was in for 14 months. A couple of administrative detainees who had had their detentions renewed started hunger strikes. The first and perhaps most famous is Father Adnan, and most famous probably because he was the first, who went on an open-ended hunger strike and just demanded that he be released. And he actually was released. But what was significant about the hunger strikes, and that it eventually led, in fact, to a prison-wide system hunger strike. So prisoners throughout the prison systems went on hunger strike. And eventually had some of their demands agreed to, though Israel has reneged on them significantly since the agreement. But what is far more significant to me about the hunger strikes was what it did to Palestinian society, because for the first time in 10 years at least, there were protests that weren't just my village, my land, right? But were about a Palestinian-wide issue. Everybody has a prisoner in the family. Absolutely everybody. I can't imagine a Palestinian family that does not have someone who is either currently in prison or just got out, right? And so the prisoner issue is something that everyone can rally around. And what was happening with the hunger strikers was that even though the hunger strikers were not well-known people, they were not leaders of political parties. In fact, they were all members of a very small political party that doesn't have a lot of support, the Islamic Jihad. The populace took up the issue of prisoners, and you had massive demonstrations, and it was really kind of significant. So one of these pictures that I want to point out to you, it looks scary at first, but we're going to talk about it. It's going to be okay, is this one. What's interesting about this picture, first of all, just so you know, Palestinians cover their faces at demonstrations because the Israeli military takes pictures of them and then can go and arrest them later by identifying their pictures. So it's not to look scary. It's actually just a defense against being arrested. But what is fascinating about this picture is if you can decode inter-Palestinian activism, you know that this guy is a member of Fatah, and this guy is a member of the PFLP, and this guy is a member of Hamas, 3 different Palestinian political parties. Palestinians have become ever more divided by their political parties, especially since the very controversial elections in 2007. And so what you had was, for the first time, a really, truly united front of Palestinians from all political parties. This is a socialist communist party, this is an Islamist party, this is sort of the mainstream party, all factors of society coming together. This picture was taken outside of Birzeit University, right, where they had come, not outside, they're from Birzeit, at the checkpoint near into Ramallah, where Birzeit is held.
What's the first party? On the left?
Fatah, Yasser Arafat's party. This is another thing that has emerged in Palestinian nonviolent resistance.
Could you just
which
tell that
is,
from the color of their keffiyehs?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
and also because I knew who they were.
Okay.
But yes, that's okay. So what also has happened is that there's this myth that women aren't involved, right? There's a myth that women don't participate in politics in the Middle East in general. That extends to Palestine. It's always been a myth. I've always seen women at demonstrations. Some villages have it more than others, depending on a lot of different factors. But the idea that like women suddenly joined the movement is really kind of false. This was a demonstration that PSP organized at a checkpoint to try to protesting the limitations on allowing Palestinians into Jerusalem. So it's a checkpoint between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And they decided that rather than sort of doing, you know, the usual kind of march up to soldiers and, you know, shout, or stay back from soldiers and throw stones, that they would play soccer. Because it seemed like kind of a different thing to do. The purpose of it was to block settler traffic, which uses the checkpoints also to connect settlers into Jerusalem, and to protest the fact that settlers can go into Jerusalem but Palestinians can't. But rather than doing something that would seem particularly confrontational, they decided to play soccer. This woman is an organizer from a village in the Hebron district, and she kept trying to get the soldiers to kick the ball back. It didn't really work, but I just think it's a nice picture, because it was cold, and it was like, oh, we're going to play soccer in this. This is another initiative that PSP has been involved in. Oh, that's tiny. I don't know if I can, ooh, that's nice. Okay, you get the idea. Here's what this is about. In 2010, an Israeli woman, a journalist named Ilana Hammerman, brought a couple of young Palestinian women from the West Bank into Tel Aviv. It's illegal to bring Palestinians who don't have permits into Israel. And then she wrote an article about it in Haaretz, in the Israeli newspaper. And she said, look, they wanted a day at the beach. And Ilana Hammerman, who was not an activist, I mean, she was progressive, but she was a journalist, she's a writer. There was a campaign organized by a right-wing Israeli group to get the Attorney General to bring charges against her for smuggling people smuggling. And what happened was a group of Israeli women, middle-aged women, not the typical running around the West Bank joining demonstrations group of Israelis, decided that they wanted to first of all support Ilana and to turn this into a political act. And so they started a group called We Will Not Obey, which was about connecting Palestinian women and Israeli women, and not just sitting and talking, but actually together defying the Israeli occupation. And so what they were going to do together was to cross these checkpoints illegally. And then the Israelis were announcing in their newspapers who they were and that they had done this. That we will not obey the rule of separation. We believe in Palestinians' right to go to the beach. It's like demand the right to the beach. These are two of the Palestinian women. They started with Beit Omar. They started and came to talk to me and my husband and said, we want to find some Palestinian women who are willing to do this. It's also illegal for the Palestinian women. They can go to jail if they're caught. But what was fascinating about it was it's actually a harsher crime for the Israelis than for the Palestinians. You had this very unique situation in which the Israelis were actually taking a larger risk than the Palestinians in doing this activity, which changed the power dynamics a little bit.
How did they get through the checkpoint?
Really good question. So, if anybody who's been through a checkpoint knows that the checkpoints, if you're on a checkpoint that's just from a settler highway, which is like the ones, most of them are not from a Palestinian city, but really are just in the middle of the West Bank and a highway, settlers drive through them all the time. And they don't get stopped. So the way that soldiers figure out which cars to stop is by profiling people, see what they look like in the car. So all the Palestinian girls had to do was take their headscarves off, put on flappy sun hats, and they got through. We got 150 women through on 12 trips.
Ooh.
Have never been caught.
Don't the Israeli cars have different license plates?
Yeah, we just put them in Israeli cars,
Yeah.
sure. Right? But what was interesting about it was that, first of all, it created a new relationship of Palestinian and Israeli women-based that were, again, not just talking, but actually defying law together, civil disobedience together. And they still actually do different activities together. I think they just did another trip to the beach. It's great. Just P.S. What was great about it was that after the first couple of times, Palestinian women were coming up to me and being like, well, we want to go to the beach. And I was like, you do know, like, okay, here's the thing. It's a political statement. It's illegal. We don't have permits. And they're like, we understand. We know that there are no permits. Like, we get it. We've heard of this before. Like, you don't have to explain that to us. We want to go to the beach. And I was like, okay.
What are the laws, different laws, like, for the
Well, Israelis in theory could be charged with smuggling people.
Oh, okay.
Smuggling infiltrators, which is just a slightly harsher charge than Palestinians just being present in Israel illegally. In theory, of course, the punishment for Palestinians could be worse because Palestinians just spend longer periods of time in jail than Israelis. But what was also interesting about it is that it is actually fairly rare for the Israeli military to hold Palestinian women prisoners. There are very few women prisoners. They arrest and detain people, but they actually don't have the capacity to really hold many women long periods of time. And so that was one of the many reasons why we did it with women. The men, by the way, were like, well, we want to do it too.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, no. Yeah, you guys can do your little protest. We're going to the beach. So just two more pictures. This is what a demonstration looks like today in Beit Omar. This was taken a few weeks ago, actually. This is the settlement. Musa, my husband, who was getting arrested, lying on the ground by the bulldozer, was like, that was like here. This is the fence that he was protesting the construction of. It did get constructed. And there's been protests on and off at that site ever since. And what is really, I think, sort of the important thing to take away from this is twofold. One is that Palestinians, whether they're particularly nationally, well organized nationally or not, they happen to be in a period in which they're not particularly well organized on the large scale, are daily resisting occupation, whether it's an organized demonstration like this one was, or individualized acts of trying to reach land that they are prevented from reaching, hunger strikes, and the like. And what the Israeli military has made very clear, and the Israeli government, is that none of it will be tolerated, right? And so even, this probably was a demonstration of 20 people. It happens every week. They march up to a line of soldiers at a fence. It's like not the most threatening, confrontational situation you could imagine. And yet that is the level of military response. You have tons of soldiers, and they point guns at you. His name's Hamza. He's 14. He's of that family that has everyone who's been in jail. He was first arrested when he was 12. And this was a few months ago, and that is Musa. He was arrested in the same location near the settlement. Again, the fence was built 6 years ago, right? There's not active military presence, but part of what's happening is that the military attempts to keep Palestinians out of the area, because then eventually they can move that fence further and further in. And so he was, I think they went to bulldoze some of the agricultural and the Palestinian agricultural land on the area that's near the fence, but on the Palestinian side of the fence. They're, in theory, even by the military standards, allowed to be there. And they just didn't like that Musa was there, so they arrested him. And when Palestinians are arrested, they're blindfolded. So it's universal practice. And in this particular case, since I think the soldiers didn't really understand why they had arrested him, they sort of made him sit under a tree for a few hours and eventually held him, I think this time for about 3 days, and then released him. So, let's do questions.
Are you concerned about your daughter, because you travel, and could she be arrested?
She can't right now because she's only 2 and a half, and I don't think they would, hopefully they would not arrest a 2 and a half-year-old. We originally decided that we couldn't we didn't want to live there permanently for, in 2010 for a couple of reasons. One was that we needed, the economic situation in Palestine is incredibly desperate, and so even though we have an NGO, we actually don't pay salaries, and so I needed to get a job. But also because the Israeli military had invaded our house. And they do that to activists, as I said, quite frequently. But there's something really horrifying about being in a house with an 8-month-old and therefore not being able to do anything about the soldiers coming in. So rather than being able to do my usual, like, protest, you know, what are you doing here? Get out of my house, whatever. I was like, I was holding a kid. And so that is a very difficult question for me to answer. We intend to move back.
And he still has 20% of his land?
20% of his land. Yes, our intention is to move back. I am just going to law school now, actually. But, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say one more thing, which was that the last time I traveled into Israel, Palestine, I got Israeli citizenship, which I don't recommend for everyone, but I knew that Musa was not, there was a potential that Musa would not get a visa to the United States, and I knew that they had denied me entry before, and I didn't want to be prevented from being able to see him. And so I actually applied for Israeli citizenship based on the law that says that Jews from anywhere around the world can get citizenship in Israel. I felt a little bit more comfortable doing that because since my mother is not born Jewish, Israel recognizes me as Jewish enough to get citizenship, but not actually Jewish. So on my ID, I am identified as a non-Jew. So I didn't help the demographic numbers of Israel. I am unidentifiable. I am what do they say? Me and my daughter because on your ID you have your nationality, which is not what nation you're from, but rather if you're Jewish or Arab. And you have your religion. Actually, the religion is just in the registry. It's not on the actual ID anymore, but you have to do that when you apply for citizenship. And so I had put for my daughter that her nationality was Palestinian and that her religion was other. They didn't accept that, so she just has undetermined on her on her registration papers.
Wow.
She's so undetermined, no one knows who she is. But so the last time that we entered, there was a warrant out for my arrest because, in theory, in case people don't know this, even Israel, even for Jews, is not really a democracy. So people that keep saying that Israel is a democracy for Jews, Israel is a democracy for Jews that fall under a particular category, which apparently is not me. Marrying a Palestinian kind of gets you excluded from that group. So I've been arrested a few times during demonstrations. And the way the Israeli civilian court works, which is what I fall under as an Israeli citizen, is that local prosecutors and police stations have an enormous amount of leeway in prosecuting, in raiding your house, in doing all kinds of things. And so the prosecutor from the settlement that is in charge of me as a person, because I live in Beit Omar, so of course the civilian police that has jurisdiction over me is from a settlement, a Hebron settlement, which means that they are enthusiastically Zionist. They don't like me. And so what they did was they said that they had attempted to contact me and that I had fled the country. They said that I had they had attempted to prosecute me for one of these old protest things, which were 3 years ago, and couldn't contact me. And so when I came into the airport in this happened just in July, there was a warrant for my arrest. And they couldn't figure out what to do because I was with a 2.5-year-old. And you can't, like, they really don't have a system to arrest 2.5-year-olds yet. I mean, I'm sure eventually
But they
they'll
have
come up
done
with
it with African infiltrators.
Oh yeah, well they've
arrest
created,
children.
they've built new prisons specifically to hold families for immigrants. But they still have, I don't know, they're not quite at the place where they're going to hold, you know, dissident Jews there. So in the end, they just, I was not arrested, but the potential is there. They kind of didn't know what to do because it was like, she's a Jew, but her kid is a Palestinian, and what do we do? Other questions?
It's just so racist.
Yeah, it's
It's like
awesome.
so blatant. Like,
Well, it's interesting because it is racist, and you have to understand that also within Israeli society it is becoming more and more about politics than about race. Strangely enough, Jews who are openly against the system, and I mean really against the system, I'm not saying like holding a sign, I'm saying like they support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They're coming out to demonstrations. They're supporting the immigrant refugees. There are more and more calls within Israeli society to just say, you know, they love the Arabs so much, why don't they go live with them? So there's actually an increase in intolerance for Jews that fall in that category as well, basically by saying you're not really Jewish. Yeah, I mean, there's still racial or ethnic undertones, but.
Well, there's something like, I'm sorry, first of all, that I wasn't here from the beginning, I apologize. But there's something about the incident in Bekah in Jerusalem, but there have been others, where specifically about miscegenation. About, you know, the Palestinians are coveting the Jewish women, blah, blah, blah. How does that, I mean, how does that fit, obviously, with your story and the reactions that you may get, you know, about maybe reactions about your husband on the one hand, but about yourself as well as being called either, either a traitor or a prostitute.
Right. Both, actually. I've gotten lots of both. It's interesting because the Grassroots story, which for people who don't know, basically what happened was a couple of young Palestinian boys were 16, 17-year-olds were walking down the street in the middle of West Jerusalem, which frankly is an area that Palestinians do often walk in. It's not super segregated as it was even 6 or 7 years ago. And it was at night, and a mob of Israeli youth attacked them and beat one almost to death. And part of what the mob said they did it for was because they thought the Palestinian boys were there to pick up Jewish women. And there's been a lot of activity in Israel, protests and petitions and polls that have shown that somewhere around 76% of the Jewish population think that Jewish women who have relationships with the Arabs are, by definition, traitors. It's nothing new. Part of what happened, part of my ongoing relationship with the Israeli military in Beit Omar was about that, was about the fact that the military and the local police station knew that I was married to a Palestinian and knew that I was Jewish, and didn't like it. And really, you know, I mean, I remember a soldier arresting me and later accusing me of assaulting a soldier, which is a nice way of getting me to have to stay the night in jail, because he said to me, your father didn't teach you what to do with your, so you went and slept with an Arab. That's a nice way of putting it. And then I shouted at him and he arrested me and said that I assaulted him, shockingly. But, you know, that attitude, what's really important to understand about that attitude, first of all, is that it's not new, but also that it indicates why Israeli society is what it is, why the military and the government are allowed to do what the military and the government are allowed to do by its own citizens. It is not because Jews are crazy or, you know, just fanatical Zionists. That's actually not the reason behind it. The reason behind it is that when they built Zionism from its beginnings, right, you had to convince a population that it was okay to be ethnically pure and therefore reject other ethnicities. And when you talk about Zionism in that way, when you talk about Jews having some sort of inherent right to be a people to the exclusion of other people in the same land, racism, overt racism, is a natural consequence of that. It's just a continuation of the same mentality. It's saying to people, we're special. Well, if we're special, then they're not special. And if they're not special, we can treat them as second-class citizens. And then when you have a situation of, you know, us crossovers or traitors, we are not only defying that logic, but we're actually holding a mirror up to it and saying, you know, this is actually a false dichotomy, right? I've lived in a Palestinian village for 4 years, 5 years, and I have never been attacked by Arab mobs. I've never been forcibly converted. I've never been held hostage. You know, I mean, occasionally old women like really wanted me to marry their sons before I got married. It was all very nice. You know, there was no forcing. You know, they would show me pictures of them and of their sons. But really, that happened with Jews too. So you know, I mean. Yeah. So the one thing that I wanted to sort of close on is that there is hope in Palestinian society for mobilization. There is a lot of despair, as Ali Abu Nima said yesterday, but there are moments, these pockets of hope. And what we're trying to do as Palestine Solidarity Project is to infuse some resources into those areas. So one of the things we're doing is organizing strategy meetings for Palestinian women to organize, you know, from across society. The important part is about bringing people physically together in situations because they've been so divided for so long. We are raising money for that. If people want to stop by our table, which is downstairs, we have some literature on the Students for Justice in Palestine table, that people can get more information about the kind of different projects that we're doing. Yeah, any more questions?
I have one. In your picture about the three protesters, and you said one was from Fatah.
Mm-hmm.
Do Fatah regulars get involved in the protests? Or what's the political situation?
Fascinating question. The protests right now, the situation of Palestinian nonviolent protests is still fairly divided by political party, which was again why the protests for hunger strikers was so significant. Fatah participates in Fatah organized protests. That's true. I say that, but I say it with a caveat, which is that, again, when there are situations of urgency, when there are situations like the hunger strikers, when there are situations like in Beit Omar, when a year ago when settlers came in and killed a young boy, a student of mine actually, the political party thing goes away. You know, I mean, there's still like Palestinians are Palestinians. So I don't want to paint a purely optimistic picture because there are some real difficulties with divisions. And what I think is important for us as people who want to support and help Palestinians is to recognize that there are divisions and to support the initiatives that try to overcome those divisions. And you know, not to sort of feed into them or make them more than what they are. Also, other questions?
It seems like with the protests in Ramallah in July, where there was like Palestinian on Palestinian violence, like there's been a tendency towards protesting the PA, not just the occupation. So like, how has that affected your work as someone who tries to facilitate the like gathering of Palestinians towards the cause?
Well, the Palestinian Authority is a puppet of the Israeli military occupation. So part of what those protesters, some of them are actually part of this women's initiative that we're working on for this meeting, are from the organizing body of those protests. So, you know, I've had lots of conversations with them. The Palestinian Authority, it's not seen as Palestinian on Palestinian violence. I mean, the Palestinian PA police officers were violent towards the Palestinian protesters, certainly. But the Palestinian Authority has become a tool of the Israeli military. In fact, it always was. It hasn't become it. And so targeting the Palestinian Authority is not antithetical to targeting the Israeli military occupation. It's saying to its own people, stop cooperating. And that's what those protests were about, were specifically about the cooperation with Israel. So it wasn't like people were protesting. Now you had this other kind of interesting development in the cities recently, which were the economic strikes, right? That there were protests, there was like Occupy Palestine, it's a terrible term, but, right? It was like economic protests and strikes against the elite and the rising prices of fuel and the economic situation. But again, what people began to focus on was the fact that it's a false economic situation because of the Israeli occupation, because of the protocol, the Paris Protocol and the Oslo Accords, which created the economic situation that they are now in. And so for us, you know, the other thing to understand is that the Palestinian Authority has much less direct impact on villages than it does in cities because of the way it's separated. So for our work, because our work is focused in the villages, we have less direct kind of issue with that. But we support the protests against the Palestinian Authority specifically because of what those protests are targeting. It's not like people are saying, you know, we don't like, I don't know, the color of our passports or something that like the Palestinian Authority actually has control over. It's saying, your collaboration with Israel has got to stop. You've got to stop being the puppets and be our representatives, not theirs. Anything else? Cool, well, thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And stop by the SJP table and get some literature if you like to read about what we're doing.
How far is Beit Omar from Israel? I mean, from Jerusalem?
It is a 20-minute drive, 25-minute drive from Jerusalem, if you're in like a private car. Yeah.
It's close to Hebron?
It's halfway between Bethlehem and Hebron, on the highway between Bethlehem and Hebron.
Okay.
It's right smack in the middle. So like they're part Hebroni.
You recommend stopping there on the...
Of course, we one of the things that PSP does, and you should get our website and look at it more. But we have we host delegations and we offer tours. So people that are organizing trips often. Sabeel actually, when they do the Sabeel wide, they've had Beit Omar on their tour. So let me know if you're interested.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for
Great,
doing
thank
it.
you.